Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean, who's behind the camera. Can't see him. What we're going to do today is we are going to replace the transmission mount and the engine mounts, also known as insulators, on my 2000 Toyota 4Runner SR5 four-wheel drive. Now you might be wondering, well, why are you replacing them, Timmy the Toolman? Well, I bought my truck used, and I've always noticed a little bit of movement in the transmission shifter, and I was always wondering how much movement is normal, how much is abnormal. I also have that slip yoke binding problem where I get that rear end clunk, and I'm sort of thinking that maybe worn out transmission and engine mounts are exacerbating that clunk, a little bit of more movement in the whole drivetrain system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull them out and test them against the new ones. I'm going to crank on them with my hands or maybe with a pry bar and just see how much movement there is between the new one compared to the old one. And then who knows, when I pull one of them out, there might actually be a separation in the actual rubber from the metal. Let me show you what one of these looks like. So this is the transmission mount, and so it's rubber sandwiched between two metal pieces. And I don't know how this is affixed, but it's some type of vulcanization process where they affix the rubber between the two metal pieces. And over time, this rubber will fatigue, and it could actually tear somewhere in the middle, or more commonly tear right along where it affixes to the metal on either side. That's what will happen to these mounts. Before we get started to take those components off the truck, is we're gonna show you how you can test to see if you have gross movement or an actual broken mount before you even get involved in doing the same thing we're doing today. So to start things off, we're going to show you how you can check the transmission mount and the engine mounts for excessive play or actually a broken mount altogether. All right, so let's go to the truck. Okay, we're going to start off by showing you how you can inspect the transmission mount. Right now, this is actually the new mount installed. And when I originally was checking the old mount, I was just having Sean put it in drive and reverse, looking for abnormal movement in the rubber mounts between the two metal pieces. But I didn't really see anything, and it didn't occur to me till after the repair that you could get a pry bar in there and you can check to see if you have any separation of the rubber from the metal or any big cracks that would let this mount move excessively. So just get yourself a big pry bar like so, sandwich in between right here, and you can see that when I rock this thing, the mount is moving. Crank on it on one end, then get underneath it in another spot and just rock it up and down and just see if you see any major damage with the rubber insulators. And if there is, then you're due for a change. So that's how I would suggest doing it, by getting a pry bar sandwiched right in between here and prying up to get a little bit of movement. Okay, now I'm inside my truck and we're going to check to see if there's excessive movement in the motor mounts or there's actually a broken motor mount. So you can do this by yourself. You don't need anybody to help you. With the hood popped up, you're going to be looking right underneath the hood at the lower part of the windshield at your engine. So I'm going to start it up. I'm going to have my left foot applying pressure on the brake. I'm going to put it in drive and I'm going to give a little gas. And I'm going to see the engine torque a little bit, but it shouldn't really raise up a lot. If it moves a lot, then it could either be a partially separated or broken mount, or just the rubber's getting a little bit tired. So you should see the engine torque a little bit, but not any gross movement or actually lifting up height-wise. It should kind of torque left or right, depending on whether you're in drive or reverse. So here I go, I'm going to start it up. I put it in drive, I got my left foot applying pressure on the brake, and now I'm going to give a little bit of gas input. Right now, from my vantage point, it's torquing up on the left side, on the driver's side. So the engine's wanting to rock clockwise. Now I'm going to put it in reverse, and it should be the opposite. So now the right side of the engine is lifting up the passenger side, and it wants to move counterclockwise. So you should see a little bit of movement. That rubber and the insulators or mounts are giving a little bit, but not excessively. If you saw the engine lift up, like really lift up high, like a couple inches, that means your motor mount is broken. So all right, so here's the parts. This is the transmission mount, and we got the part number right here, 12371 62120. And you see they actually call it an insulator. Actually engine insulator, but it's actually the transmission mount. Then you go to the 2 for the engine. They're both the same part number. They're both 12361 62160. And now maybe I'll open one up. So this is what it actually looks like in its full glory. So again, you have rubber sandwiched between two metal pieces. And then again, this is the transmission mount. And it's got this little nylon doohickey that goes down into the cross member. If you're wondering what motor mounts do for you, is they absorb vibration. So the fact that the motor and the transmission is suspended on the frame with these mounts soak up vibration, and it also allows for a little bit of movement. So when the suspension's moving and the whole truck is moving, these mounts allow for a little bit of movement in the drivetrain, and it also absorbs vibration. So you could imagine if you had a vibrating engine and a vibrating transmission connected directly to the frame, metal on metal, all that vibration would make its way up into the passenger compartment. It insulates the engine and transmission, which are your main drivetrain components that allow you to go down the road. They allow the drivetrain to move on the frame and prevent vibration making its way back into the passenger compartment, just vibrating everything to death. And this is what I paid for them. So I like using Camelback Toyota for most of my Toyota OEM part needs. They ship quick, their prices are good, and they're easy to deal with. So again, you'll see that they call it an insulator. They don't actually call it a transmission mount. This is the 2 engine mount insulators, and both of them together was 127 bucks. And the shipping was... So what are we using as a reference for this job? Of course, the factory service manual right here. So we're in the engine mechanical section for the 6-cylinder engine with the 4-wheel drive. So it explains to remove the engine, you got to remove the mount. So it comes to this point right here. It gives you all these steps of removing different components, and then it shows you that you actually install an engine hanger by removing the AC compressor wire clamp out of the way. We're not going to use this technique, but it basically shows 2 spots, and it shows the passenger side better by giving this direction about the AC compressor. But when you go to the other side, it just shows a pictorial of having an engine mount on the driver's side too. And so who knows where that one connects to. We're not going to use this technique. I don't have an engine puller. I'm going to actually jack up the engine via the oil pan. Here's the mounts that it's talking about. It says remove the 4 bolts and nuts holding the engine front mounting insulators to the frame. And then once you get the old ones out and the new ones in, it gives you a torque spec, and all those nuts and bolts are torqued to 28 foot-pounds. So that's our torque spec for the engine mount. So let me show you the pages for the transmission mount. So this is a full schematic of showing the related parts. So this is cross member number 3, and that's our actual mount. So we got the torque specs for this. The 2 bolts that hold the mount to the transmission are 48 foot-pounds, and then you got 2 on each side, so you have 4 total of those bolts, 48 foot-pounds. And then you have the cross member bolts. We're going to remove this cross member number 3 as part of it, and then put it back together, retorque them. So those are torqued to 53 foot-pounds. And then the 4 small bolts that hold the mount to the cross member itself, those are a much lighter torque spec of 13 foot-pounds. So for the transmission, we have 3 different torque values that we have to pay attention to. And finally, for the transmission, the book shows how you support the transmission while you're removing all the cross member bolts and the transmission mount bolts to remove it. So it goes through these 2 steps right here. It again gives you the torque values again in this area of the book. All right, so we're ready to start working. We have the truck jacked up in the front and supported on 6-ton jack stands on the frame on either side. And we have one of the rear wheels chalked fore and aft so the truck can't move anywhere. And we also got the emergency brake set tight, so the truck's not going to go anywhere and it's supported really well. So now I'm going to get underneath the truck and we're going to start working on getting the transmission mount out first. So I'm going to undo the 3 bolts that hold this plastic cover on to get it out of the way so it's easier for me to access the crossmember bolts on the driver's side. They're all 12 millimeter. And just get this thing out of the way. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the 4 bolts that hold the transmission mount to crossmember number 3. So there's 2 on the driver's side of the crossmember and 2 on the passenger side of the crossmember. They're 12 millimeter, and I'm going to zip them out with a cordless impact. These are very short bolts, by the way, not much threads. Okay, so those 4 bolts are out. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to support the transmission with the transmission jack underneath the transmission oil pan, and then we're going to work on getting this crossmember number 3 out of the way. So we have the transmission jack underneath the transmission oil pan. I have a high density rubber pad, a little bit of extra cushion for the pushing. And then now we're going to jack this up. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure on it to get a little bit of separation of the mount. I just saw the mount move off crossmember number 3. Now I'm going to stop there and I'm going to work on getting the crossmember bolts out of both sides and get the crossmember out of the way. Before you get started, you have a couple choices. You could slip this rubber exhaust mount grommet off the hanger so this thing will be free, or there's 2 bolts up here. I think slipping the rubber off is easier than trying to access these bolts. It's probably an easier thing. So I'm just going to try to pry this off, maybe spray a little bit of lubricant on there first. I actually pushed it a little bit already. You see how it slides. So I'm going to just spray maybe a little WD-40 and then slide it off. So I'm using a little WD-40. Silicone spray might be a better option, but I don't have any silicone sprays. And then now I'm going to try to force that off. I think I'm going to need a little pry bar. There we go. I was just prying it between the crossmember number 3 with the tip on the grommet. And I should be able to get it off. Now it's free, so now it's not going to hang us up. So here's my setup. I'm going to take the nuts off, and on the front side, I'm just going to hold it with this breaker bar with a 14 millimeter half-inch drive. Now I got a deep 14 millimeter impact socket. Okay, here's one, and the bolt just comes right out. I'll just screw them together so they don't separate them. Okay, now I'm going for the second bolt nut on the passenger side. So now we're working on the driver's side ones. Man, those things are rough threads. Lots of resistance. You could feel the heat, how hot it was coming off. And the last one. I say this a lot, but these impact guns make it a lot easier on you because there was a lot of resistance. This thing's smoking hot right now. So these impact guns save you a lot of forearm fatigue. This thing should just pop out like so. So this is your crossmember number 3 with the exhaust bracket attached. So the exhaust bracket is on your passenger side. Just like any good practice, note the orientation of how the transmission mount affixes to the transmission. So this nylon plug that sticks down faces more towards the front of the rig than the back of the rig. So that's your orientation. So when you're putting the new mount in, just remember that the nylon plug goes towards the front of the truck, not the back of the truck. All right. These are also 14 millimeter nuts, 2 on each side. This side, on the passenger side, looks like you could get it with a gun. The other side, you've got the drive shaft in the way, and so I'm going to have to get those with a box and wrench. Now I'm going to grab a box end, a ratcheting one, and get these other two off on the driver's side. So I have basically a foot long 14 millimeter. One side's ratcheting, the other side is a solid. So I'm just going to try to break it free with the solid side first and then ratchet it maybe. So that came out pretty easy. I don't think the torque spec is that high for these. So unless you live in the Rust Belt, this one might be a little harder to get to. Limited space. I flipped the wrench over. I was trying to use it this way. I flipped it over. I'm able to get it on there pretty good. Now I got it started. Now I'm just going to ratchet them off. Okay, I'm working on the last bolt on the driver's side. I'm supporting the mount with my right hand while unscrewing the last bolt with my left hand. All right, it's free. Now I'm going to take it to the bench and I'm going to compare the play in the rubber mount with the new mount and see if there's any major difference. Okay, this is the old mount. I got it mounted in my vise securely, and I'm just going to use my arm strength. You can see cracks pulling away. It actually has a fair amount of movement back and forth. Okay, now we have the new mount, and I'm going to push the same amount. Well, there actually is a fair amount of play, even in the new mount. So maybe that's how it's designed, to have a little more movement. The difference is that the old mount had cracks along here. So this one actually does have a fair amount of play. I'm pushing about the same amount, so maybe that one wasn't that worn out as I thought. So let me try the other one again. So you can see the cracks starting to develop here. But what's interesting to note that it doesn't seem like the rubber has that much more play compared to the new one. Not really. So I would have to say that this mount probably was still good and had more life to it, but the fact that it's starting to crack means that who knows how much longer it has before it cracks all the way, but it's just barely through on this side. Looking on the other side, I see also cracks, but right now I would say the mount was in decent shape for being 17 years old and having 163,000 miles on it. This might be a better view of where the cracking is. You can see that there's cracks forming right where the rubber affixes to the metal. It's got some wear on it, a little bit of damage, but still halfway intact. There's some cracking going along in here too, and then right here too. So by looking at the factory service manual, we just noticed a discrepancy in the book regarding the torque spec, which is fairly common with the factory service manual being wrong at times. So the 4 bolts that hold the cross member to the frame, they should be 53 foot-pounds based off of this schematic. And comparing it to cross member number 4, they are also torqued to 53, so it would make sense that both cross members would be torqued to the same value. But now when you go further into the book to the pages describing how to remove things, it says remove the 4 bolts and nuts and number 3 cross member, and they say it's 48 foot-pounds. So that's a misprint. It should have said 53 foot-pounds. So if you got the factory service manual, don't get confused. So we're going to torque the cross member bolts that bolt the cross member to the frame to 53. The 4 bolts that hold the mount to the transmission are going to be 48. And then the 4 bolts that hold the mount to the cross member are going to be 13. So remembering the nylon plug goes towards the front of the truck, I'm going to start getting the 4 bolts that hold it onto the transmission. I'm going to start them by hand. And then get these 2 started on the driver's side. Okay, we are ready to torque these to 48 foot-pounds. I'm cinching them up first. Snug them up on both sides. This driver's side is a little bit harder to get a torque wrench in, but you can get it in just enough to get them to torque. You use a short 14 millimeter socket to get in between the front drive shaft and the mount, so you can do it. So those 2 are now torqued to spec, and that'll work on the ones on the passenger side. Use a short extension, makes it easier to get in there with the short 14 millimeter socket. Okay, that one's torqued to spec, and that one's torqued to spec. So now all 4 are torqued to 48 foot-pounds. Now we're going to work on getting the cross member number 3 back in position. Might be a smart idea to kind of clean up the mount. I'm getting kind of lazy. There's a little bit of dirt and debris, but I'm just sliding it in. This is on the driver's side. Slide it up in there, and then get the other side kind of in there. It might fall on you a little bit, just like it did. And then get a bolt started, and then you can, at least it'll be holding in place on one side. Remember that the bolts go through from the front and the nut goes on the back. So I got one started on the passenger side. Now I'm going to get another one started on the driver's side. There we go. Now I don't have to worry about it falling on my face. Some point I'll get this started. Okay. Just remember when you're looking up through here that the nylon plug is going to be sticking down into the middle of the cross member. So once you have that lined up, then your bolt holes should line up pretty easily. All right, since these nuts came off pretty hard, they're probably going to go on pretty hard. The threads are just a little bit sticky. They were sticky when we did Sean's transmission job. I don't know why that is. I could have did a thread cleaner. I have the kit, but I don't feel like doing it. So I'm just zipping them on with the gun, then I'll finish with torquing them. Okay, and I'm going to get the other side. The cross-member bolts are 53 foot-pounds, the bolts and the nuts. Okay, that first one's at 53. Okay, now that you have the cross-member torque to spec, don't forget to get your exhaust grommet back connected. So just slide it over and force it on, like so. And that's it. That's all there is to it. At this point, if all you were doing was the transmission mount, you would lower the transmission onto the cross member, and then you'd get those 4 bolts back in and torque the 13 foot-pounds. We're going to keep this loose for now because we're going to jack up the engine. We're thinking that the engine will move a lot easier with this mount still disconnected, and we're not really worried about the whole transmission and engine moving too much because that nylon plug is still sticking into this cross member, holding the mount from moving fore and aft. We're just going to jack it up enough to where we can get the engine mounts out and the new ones back in. So now that you got the cross member back in, the transmission mount fixed to the transmission, we no longer need the transmission supported by the transmission oil pan. So I'm just going to slowly lower this and settle the mount onto the cross member number 3 so we can get this out of the way. Transmission jack is coming down. Now that we got the transmission mount in, we're working on the engine mounts. The first thing I'm going to do is take both front wheels off because we're going to be accessing the mount bolts through this area. Getting the tires out of the way is just going to make it a lot easier. So, using my impact gun. So I'm going to slip off this mud flap doohickey chingadera. You just pull on it to expand the hole and then slide it over. So you just do that for each one and you can get it off of there just like so. You don't need to see me do each one, but we want to get at the mount, which is right back here. Yeah, so the mount is right here. So that's why I'm getting the mud flap out of the way. So in order to get a better view as I'm working on the mount, because it's a little bit hidden in there, I'm going to remove this little cover, just like little tabs, and get this out of the way. There we go. Now I have a better view in here towards where I can look at the mount better. It's a lot easier with this thing out of the way. We're still on the driver's side. This is one of the bolt and nuts that holds the mount to the frame. So there's one right here, and then there's another one on the front side. So here's the 17 millimeter nut that holds the mount to the engine. So that is pretty hard to get to, and I'll show you how I got on there with a flex head ratchet with a long 17 millimeter socket. So there's that, and then this right here is the front bolt and nut that holds the mount to the frame. So I'm using a shorter flex head ratcheting 14 millimeter on the top, holding it with the longer flex head on the bottom. So this is how I attack the front bolt and nut that holds the mount to the frame. I had a flex head long wrench underneath holding the bolt head, and then I used the shorter flex head ratcheting head to spin the nut off. And so the nut goes on the top, flange nut, and then on the bottom there's a washer. So the washer goes through on the bottom with the flange nut on top. So now I'm going to tack the rear mount. So right now on the rear mount bolt nut that holds the mount to the frame, I've got a long box end 14 on the top nut, and then I'm holding the bottom with a open end 14. I'm gonna break it loose. Okay, I got it loose. Now I'm gonna see if I can get the ratcheting head side on there. To get this 17 millimeter nut easier, there's a electrical connection that slides on this little clamp. So I slid it off of here and got it up out of the way. I don't know exactly what this goes to, but this flexes, and then you could see the nut right here. My index finger is pointing at it. So pretty hard to get to with the conventional ratchet. It's almost kind of imperative to have a special wrench. So I'll show you what I got in there to loosen it. I've got this gear wrench, ratcheting head, 3/8 drive wrench with a long 17 millimeter socket. So you have to get in there at an angle to drop it in there. And so you're actually loosening it like in this fashion with it bent in there. So you're not getting a straight 90-degree shot. You actually have to have it bent quite a bit in order to turn it and loosen it, but you can do it. It's just pretty hard to get in there if you don't have it. So instead of moving this out of the way, I just moved that to show you. I'm going over the top of that and then dropping the socket onto there. Now it's on there, and I already broke it free. So you can see you have limited space. You got the wiring for the alternator in the way. You've got this little bracket in the way that maybe you could remove. This ratchet I bought it has a lot of click points. It has 120 click points. So it means you don't have to turn it very much to get to the next click. So you can take something off that's a really tight area where you can't get a lot of movement out of the ratchet. So this is almost kind of key. So now I've got it loose. I'm loosening it with my fingers, the 17 millimeter nut. Okay, and that's out. So here's the nut. So now the driver's side should be completely free. Once we jack up the engine, that mount should be able to come out. Just like the driver's side, on the passenger side, remove this rear mud flap, and then I'm going to remove this front mud flap just so I can get a better look at what I'm doing. So the same setup that worked to get the 17 millimeter nut loose is going to work on the passenger side too. Long 17 millimeter socket, flex head, ratcheting wrench with a lot of click points, 120 clicks. So you're getting it right in front of the starter, get it on there. You could see how the ratcheting arm needs to be a little bit bent in order to turn it. It comes off with quite a bit of force, but I already broke it free, so you can do it if you've eaten your Wheaties today or your spinach like Popeye. Also to note, I don't want the socket to slip off the nut, so I'm reaching in front of the upper control arm and the shock absorber, reaching and pushing pressure on the top of the ratchet to keep it in place while turning with my left hand to loosen, like so. And now it's fairly loose now. So to start off with, I have the long 14 millimeter box end on the top, and what I've noticed is that you can start to remove it. You don't necessarily have to hold the bolt head. You can start to loosen it, and that loosened no problem, and the bolt didn't turn on me. I got it loose without having to have to hold the other side. Now that I got it loose, it'll start to spin on me, so I have to get another wrench on the back side. A little tight to get your hands in here. If you've got big arms like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you might have a little bit of trouble getting in here, but if you access it one way and it's too tight, try another way. Now I'm like resting my wrist on the upper control arm on the back side, and I'm able to get in there a little easier than the way I was before. So now the back nut and bolt is free. So for this front mount on the passenger side, I have a long flex head box end wrench, ratcheting head, and I was able to get it, but again, it's not a straight shot. It has to be bent down a little bit to access it because there's too much stuff in the way. The AC compressor's right there, the upper control arm's in the way. So now that I got the nut loose, I'm gonna get an open end on the bottom, kind of reaching along the side of the AC compressor. It's a little tight to get in there with my hand, but I got it loose. Now I think I can get it with my fingers. Okay, this is where I'm going to lift it up. If you had an engine hoist, you would affix mounts to the engine and lift it up like you're pulling the engine. I saw in a Toyota forum a guy put a 4x4 right here, section of 4x4, and lifted right to the front of the oil drain plug. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this plastic 2x4 with this dense rubber pad, and I'm going to put it right here, same place where he put it, and then I'm going to jack up the engine and cross my fingers that no damage occurs to the oil pan. Originally wanted to support the whole oil pan, but the oil pan is not the same depth. It has a little nub right here that's a little lower, and then you got the drain plug. Originally I was going to cut out a section to make room for this, but then when I saw this little protrusion down further, the lowest point of the oil pan, I decided it's probably better to copy what he did and just lift it right on the front side and disperse the weight along that front part of the oil pan. We decided to use 2 plastic blocks because I don't think the jack is going to be a jack up high enough, so I'm going to try to line it up as equal as possible. Let me see where that's at. Okay, go ahead, jack it up there. Engine moved a little bit. Let's stop it right there. Looks like everything's okay. We need to go up a little higher because we got to clear the stud of the mount from the engine side. So go ahead a little more. Let's see if it'll clear. Okay, this is the passenger side, and we jacked it up enough to where I'm sliding the bottom end towards the front to where the stud will clear. So you can see the stud clearing. It's got the little tab that cleared too. And then it's just a matter of figuring out how to get it out. So yeah, I just kind of fell out. So by scooting the bottom end down, and then now I got to figure out how this comes out of the engine bay altogether. Maybe if I remove this top piece first. There we go. I got this free. Let's see if I can get this thing out now. Yep. Bring it out above the sway bar and along the transmission, so it's going to come out that way. That seems to be the easiest way to get it out. So here's how the old mount goes in. It goes just like this on the passenger side. This plate goes over the top. This little nub stud here goes right here. And then this stud goes into the engine side with the 17mm nut. And then these are the 2 holes right here with a 14mm nut and bolt attach the mount to the frame. So this is the orientation. So we didn't buy another one of these because this is just a hunk of metal that you could reuse. Unless it was rusted or cracked, then you'd want to buy another one of these. But this is what we wanted to replace. This is the old one. This is the new one. Now let's take it to the bench and try to see if we can see if there's any difference in the amount of play in the bushing. So here's the old mount. I got it in the vise, checking the play. There's a tiny bit of cracking right here. Not that major. I don't even see it when I move it, it's separating. So it seems like this mount was still in pretty good shape. So let me get the new one in there and check the amount of play. This is the new mount, similar amount of play. So again, it looks like my passenger side engine mount was in pretty good shape. So it was going to be really difficult to film showing me get it in. So I basically put the mount in the same way it came out, over the top of the sway bar, along the exhaust, through here, and then when I got it about in this position, I slid it almost in place, and then I slid that top metal plate over the top, and it's tight. You gotta fiddle around with it to where you can finally get the plate over the top, and then you have to work at getting the mount in the right position to get that stud to fit into the hole on the engine side. And then I just tighten up the 17mm nut really loosely to where when I drop the engine in, I'm going to be able to get the other 14mm bolt and nut started. So I left the 17mm nut a little bit loose, not cinched up at all. Now I'm going to work on the driver's side. One thing to note is that when you're jacking up this engine, I'm kind of running out of room. I just cranked on the fan blade to get it from smashing the shroud. So I might be maxed out unless you're going to remove the shroud. I think I got finally enough room to get the mount out of the driver's side. So we'll go underneath and see. So I just pried this one fin out of the way so it's not crammed up against the shroud. You scoot the bottom end towards the engine and it pops out. So I'm reaching around the front and I'm reaching around the back of the shock absorber, and then I'm pushing the bottom down and clearing the stud. So you can see the stud start to drop out, and then now it's free. So it seemed to be that to scoot the bottom of the mount towards the engine gets it to clear the stud. So you can see that I'm going right underneath the oil filter and I'm dropping it down, and then it's clearing. So that's the way I'm going to go back in, hopefully, and then work it out this way. I'm going to take this metal top off, get that off first. It ends up that bracket was connected to the top of the mount. That way I move the electrical connection on. And then now I'm going to bring the mount down towards the lower radiator hose and out underneath the radiator. So here's the old mount. You see that separation there? So this one was starting to fail. You see how it's cracking right along the metal there. So that one had a little bit of more damage. All the mounts we've checked so far, this driver side one has had most damage. Let's turn it around and see the other side. Yeah, so you could see a little bit of damage or separation, but it's still mostly intact. So would this amount lasted the life of my truck? Who knows, maybe, but we're replacing it now. So I'm gonna go in the same way I went out, is I'm gonna go underneath the radiator, along the bottom radiator hose, get it up in there, bring it up through here. And this is where it gets harder to figure out how it all went through there. The stud goes towards the back. Then, don't know if I'm gonna try to get the plate in now or later. Let's see. So I got the mount with the metal plate off at first, got it in the position right about underneath the oil filter, got the plate on, and then I slid it in place, and again with the bottom jutted out towards the engine, I slid it in, got the stud into there, and then was able to wiggle it in place. It took a little bit of finagling, but if you have the back end kicked out and you get the stud kind of started into the hole, and then you slide the whole mount back in place, then you could get that 17 millimeter nut started, just hand tight. And then now we're going to drop the engine back down so we can get the two 14 millimeter nuts and bolts attached to the frame for the mounts on both sides. So now that we have both mounts with the 17 millimeter nuts attached on the engine side and the two 14 millimeter nuts and bolts attached to the frame side, we're going to now take the support that we put underneath the oil pan and let the engine settle where it wants to settle. Then we're going to tighten everything up. We're not going to torque it to spec because I can't figure out how to get a torque wrench in there. So we're just going to get everything good and tight. Lower it all the way. See if we did any damage. The oil pan looks good. So we didn't do anything to the oil pan, which is nice. That's what we wanted. All right, now we're going to cinch everything up. So I'm going to use again this long 14 millimeter ratcheting 6-point flex head wrench. You see that you have to get in at an angle just like we took everything off. So are you going to get an accurate torque spec even if you could get a torque wrench in there? You're not, because you have to be at like a perfect 90-degree angle to get an accurate torque spec. So the torque spec for these is 28 foot-pounds for the two nuts and bolts that hold the mount to the frame. So I'm just going to get them tight, just use my best judgment. And same with the 17 millimeter nut that holds the mount to the engine. You can't really get a torque wrench in there, so I'm just going to get it really tight and call it good. So the 4 bolts that hold the transmission mount to the cross member are supposed to be torqued to 13 foot-pounds. I'm not too concerned about it. It's my truck. I just got them tight with the short 14 millimeter ratchet and called it good. But if you want to torque them to spec, 13 foot-pounds for the 4 bolts that hold the transmission mount to cross member number 3. An easy way to get these mud guards back in onto the clips, if you slip the screwdriver in the hole of the mud guard underneath the clip to get a purchase point, then you could slide it over and work it underneath the tab. Like so. See, if you push against it, you're trying to get it behind the tab, and when you push the mud guard against the tab, you end up pushing the tab in. So if you go in first with a little screwdriver and then get underneath the edge, then you can get it started and then pull it down, just like so, and you stretch it over. Just using a small screwdriver, and you work it, just kind of shimmy it. It's by getting the screwdriver in the hole first, hooking underneath the tab, and then sliding it in. That's how you do it. Quick tip from Timmy the Toolman. All right, so we're pretty much done with this repair. How you finish everything up is you get those little mud flaps in both fender wells back in position, slipped over the little clips. You get your front wheels back on, then you drop the truck to the ground, you torque your lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds, and then you're good to go. So what I learned from this is that my transmission mount and my engine mounts were probably not ready to be replaced. So there was one engine mount that looked like it was starting to tear a little bit, but could it have lasted longer? Yeah, probably could have. But you as the viewer is going to benefit. So if you have a broken transmission mount or a broken engine mount, you've now learned how to replace them. I thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We'll be back with more videos. Bye-bye.